Hello and welcome. I'm Hania Salah, Director of the Columbia Global Center in Amman. Thank you for joining us today for a conversation with Amal Ghandour. We are delighted to bring you a discussion of her memoir, This Arab Life, A Generation's Journey into Silence. Amal Ghandour's career spans more than 3 decades in the fields of research, communication, and community development. She holds a master's in international policy from Stanford University and a Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown. She is a senior strategy advisor to Ruwad Al-Tanmiyeh, a regional community development initiative. Amal serves on the board of trustees of International College and also served on the board of directors of Ruwad Lebanon and the Arab Human Rights Fund. Amal was also a special advisor to Columbia Global Center's Amman and sits on the Women Creating Change Leadership Council at Columbia University. She is the author of a biography about this man called Ali, as well as a blogger of Thinking Fits and This Arab Life. This Arab Life, A Generation's Journey into Silence, is Amal's second book. It is an intimate and honest exploration of a rising Arab generation's descent into silence. The memoir begins in Amman in the summer of 1973 and concludes in Beirut by Ahdaf Aswaif as stylish, witty, and heartbreaking, a unique and critical contribution to our current soul searching. Other reviews applaud Amal's writing as an unflinching depiction of the author's complex international experiences. We are delighted to be involved and to have the opportunity to share this work with a broader audience. The global centers are hubs of Columbia University, currently in 9 cities around the world that work with students, faculty, and regional partners to create opportunities for shared learning and research, and to deepen the nature of global dialogue on a range of issues. This Arab Life provides a riveting reflection of the tumultuous modern Levant. Amal presents an intimate portrayal of experiences that delicately balances the fine line between nostalgia and reality. Throughout the memoir, Amal evocatively poses complex questions in connection with the watershed events of the past recent decades. These social and political crossroads have collectively impacted our societies, as well as having lingering implications for future generations. To explore these thematic areas, our webinar features Kate Seeley and Tariq Bakraouni in conversation with the author, Amal Ghandour. Kate is a senior vice president at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining MEI in 2009, Kate worked as a radio and television journalist covering the Arab world. She reported for NPR and has contributed to the BBC, Channel 4, and Frontline World. She has also worked as a producer for the PBS NewsHour. Kate is the recipient of several journalism awards, including the Alfred I. DuPont Columbia Award for NPR's team coverage of the war in Iraq. Tariq is the author of Hamas Contained, The Rise and Pacification of Palestinian Resistance. His writing has appeared in the London Review of Books, the New York Review of Books, The Nation, and the Washington Post, among others. He serves as president of the board of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. He is also the book review editor for the Journal of Palestine Studies and co-founder of Makan. Tariq is a former senior analyst with the International Crisis Group. We are looking forward to this conversation centered on the personal, social, and political theme of this Arab life. Thank you to everyone in our virtual audience for joining us. Any questions you may have can be sent via the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen. Please join me in welcoming Kate.
Thank you so much, Hania, and thanks to Columbia's Global Center in Amman for inviting me to join this platform, this discussion with Amal Ghandour. It's such an honor to share a stage with Amal and to discuss your very searing memoir. I encourage everyone to go out and order a copy now. It's a fascinating read, and it's also an honor to share a stage with Tariq Bakraouni. So Tariq and I have been asked to co-moderate this event. It's a bit like co-parenting, and I have been tasked with taking on the more personal questions and Tariq the more political questions. But of course, everything that's personal is political, and so the lines will cross and blur quite a bit, and that's that's just fine. But we hope to have a very easy flowing conversation with Amal and to bring in the audience's questions throughout. But I thought I would just start, Amal, by asking you to sort of set this stage. And I want to ask you to give our audiences who have not had a chance to read your book and may not be as familiar with the Middle East as some of us are, to sort of tell us what the premise for your book is and what motivated you to write it.
Okay, well, I mean, I think Hania gave a wonderful preface, but let me just very briefly say that this Arab life is really a chronicle of the generation that came of political age in the 1980s and our journey into silence. It's a deep introspection into the modern history of the Arab world and trying to locate the role and place of this generation in the story. And I wrote it because in 2016 and 17 were 2 years that were of unusual vulnerability for me. I had been grappling with a family tragedy for a while. And of course, we Arabs were feeling acutely the aftermath of the 2011 uprisings. And the scale of the devastation, the long-held assumptions, ideas, dreams and hopes that lay in ruin, the damage, severe damage inflicted on our social fabrics, our environment, livelihoods, our humanity really, if you like, the stuff from which a decent life is typically woven, invited a time of deep reflection. I wanted to have a very long, deep conversation with the self. And, many of the features that presumably define the contemporary Arab world began to surface in the 1980s when my generation was coming of political age. So I wanted to go beyond the reflexive answers that we had long been bandying about and try to achieve some clarity as to what transpired in this period, what was our role that helped bring us to this moment. Briefly, that's the story of this Arab life and why I really felt compelled to sit down and write it in 2018.
Yes, and sort of embedded throughout is this deep frustration with sort of, and as you put it, your generation's silence, your quiescence, and you call your generation sort of a sellouts. And I think for our audience to understand where your deep frustration with sort of the lack of political activism that your generation engages in, perhaps it would be helpful to understand a little bit about your family's history. Your father was very politically active in the 50s. I mean, speaking of sort of modern history, it was a very fascinating, rich, politically active time. And so active that, in fact, he had to flee Lebanon with a death sentence on his head to move to Jordan to become a businessman, which is where I met you. And I'm wondering if I feel like his history and his political experience has very much informed your frustration with your generation and its lack of political activism. And I'm wondering if you could talk about how his story and that history has informed what you see as your generation's failures.
Of course. Well, a couple of things. My father was indeed very active politically in the 1940s and 50s when he was, in fact, coming of political age. But I have to tell you that in the 1960s and 70s and the rest of his life, he remained politically active, but from a different angle altogether. In very early 1962, he was sentenced to death, and that is what took us to Jordan in the first place. So we are a political house par excellence. We lived it, we experienced it, we imbibed it when we were very young, and when we grew older, we engaged in it very actively, in conversation, that is. But you have to, I have to note at least that there's a 30-year distance between the time that my father came of political age and my generation came of political age. His time, his world was teeming with ideologies and political parties competing to shape the Arab world. 30 years later, in my time, it was regimes competing to shape the Arab world. By the time it was our turn, you can say that the political arena was emptied of these political and ideological powerhouses, and you had an entirely different politics, if you like, governing the Arab world. So no, I did not politically engage the way my father did. I could not politically engage the way my father did for all the obvious reasons. That was just not something that was really a free option for many in the Arab world. If you did it, you did it with a very clear understanding of the costs involved. And that, to a certain extent, goes at least to part of the story of our silence, beginning of the 1980s. So we were very political indeed, but my engagement was entirely different from my father's. His was passionate, very grassroots, visionary, but mine was, let's say, infinitely more subtle.
Well, if I may just drill into this a little bit before handing over to Tarek, because this period of inactivity starts in the 80s, where I meet you. We're both working in an NGO, and this is where your sort of frustration begins. This is when the state, the regimes start to build their structures, become increasingly sort of all powerful with their intelligence services and whatnot. And you ask in your book, in this early Amman chapter, the Jordan chapter, you ask, had your generation risen to the challenge to work or reform the system when you say the system was more pliant at the end of the 20th century? Would the 21st century be a kinder place in the Arab world? Or alternatively, would people be dead or in jail, as you've just alluded to? So, how much did your generation, ask itself these questions about, how it wanted to change and reform the region, and what options did you or did you not have? So delve a little bit more into this critical period where it all begins. Like, what questions were you asking yourself about how do I see the state system and how can I change it or not?
We did engage in these discussions and these conversations, but you have to understand that at that time in the 1980s and 90s, and this is something I refer to in the book, contempt begins to loom as a motivation for the silence. When we came of political aid, we looked back at successive Arab generations and could behold, cascading defeats on their part in trying to achieve any meaningful change in the Arab world. But more importantly, there was distinct contempt, again, for the political and ideological powerhouses that dominated the political scene post-independence. And it was not a contempt for their failure. It was a contempt for their betrayal. It's not that these political parties and ideologies fought the good fight and lost honorably. They actually buckled very quickly. They became very complicit in the failure of the Arab world itself. So when you come to the 1980s, again, you are coming into a political arena that is impoverished in many ways. There is not an inspired thought or an inspiring idea or an organizing politics. There is despondence and frustration and a certain kind of sense of loss. So that was the topic. That was the heart of the matter for us, this kind of discussion. And the path, of course, naturally became the path of pragmatism. Well, I mean, if you surveyed the region and understood that there is perhaps very little that you could do to push for meaningful change for various reasons, not only the obvious reasons of living in very oppressive settings repression or the pacifying influence of neoliberalism or anything of the sort. And these are all perfectly legitimate and convincing, but if you had to go deeper into the motivations of this silence, and one of them would be contempt, then you begin to understand why the path was the path of pragmatism, the path of piecemeal change, incremental change, things that you could do within your immediate world, the focus on the career, the focus on your immediate life, the focus on your immediate circle, and just taking care of yourself, because in the larger scheme of things, there's really very little that you could do. And you notice that in the 1980s, in point of fact, is the time when NGOs began to surge in the Arab world. I mean, and that was where, in fact, many in my generation, my particular, if you like, tribe or strata, began to see opportunities for engagement, safe engagement, because the regimes felt comfortable for you to engage in NGO work. So you began to see, even in the 1980s, for different reasons, you began to see the Arab civil society beginning to, appear increasingly in the narrative and begin to attract a lot of attention on the part of the international community as really a very vibrant, ecosystem through which, gradual, peaceful, constructive change or reforms can actually be achieved in the Arab world. I never really believed that, and I don't think that was in any way an accurate description of Arab civil society, but that's when it began to show. And that's very much at the beginning of my own generation's journey and experience with politics in the Arab world.
Thank you. I think you've given Tariq a lot of material to work with. Tariq.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Amal, for outlining that kind of trajectory. I mean, I want to push you on a couple of things which you outlined now. In your book, one of the more powerful bits is where you start referring to Arwa Saleh and her memoir, The Stillborn. And for our listeners who don't know the book, this is a memoir that's written by an activist, a revolutionary activist in Egypt in the 40s and 50s, talking specifically about the role of women in the Egyptian revolution. And she embraces a Marxist lens. And, the book is written after the failure of these revolutions, and she fears and frets and weeps and is nostalgic over the failure of her generation to affect any kind of change. And Amal, I think you see a kind of similarity there. The book moved you, from what I can tell from your own book, and led you into your own sense of introspection about the silence of your generation. But the question that I have is that, in the case of Arwa Saleh and her generation, most of her comrades and her cohort were exiled and imprisoned. Their revolution failed, but there was a sense of a revolution to begin with. Whereas in the case of your generation, with the outline that you've just given us, it felt like an almost soundless or silent retreat into pragmatism. And unlike Arwa Saleh's comrades, your generation and your constituency is very much present. They're influential. They're politically close to centers of power. They're economically affluent. So don't you think that if we just accept the rhetoric that they're pragmatic and silent, we're letting them off the hook? Don't you think that this is sort of accepting that they can't be factors of change now, and they can't use their power and their influence for more active revolutionary transformation?
I mean, that's a very interesting question. I don't necessarily let them off the hook. I think they let themselves off the hook. And I think the book is an accounting of that. look, it's a very complicated mixture of the psychological, the emotional, the realities on the ground, the politics. I do think that to a large degree, at least the elite of this generation of the 1980s felt also that they would be, if they were to engage in the way that Arwa Saleh was engaging, they would be engaging it on the pain of death or prisons or threat to family and livelihood and interests. I don't think that we should at all underestimate the extraordinary power of despotism and tyranny in demotivating you. But something that Arwa Saleh showed is that any kind of, and we know this, I mean, this is really evident, any kind of radical or serious political change necessarily involves very serious sacrifice. There is no radical political change or any radical change of any kind that does not come with sacrifice. So the question goes to the heart of the matter. Why didn't we feel compelled to sacrifice? And I don't think that you can disassociate this need to be pragmatic from what we have experienced and witnessed as the generation coming on the tail end of the generation post-independence. And then the generation of Arwa Saleh and their successive failures in achieving any kind of meaningful political change on the ground. It becomes entirely reasonable and logical to understand why my generation, in the face of cataclysmic events, and I think, newer generations probably don't have a sense, for example, of what 1967 meant to our generations. I mean, I don't remember 1967 per se. I just remember a lot of anguish, but I don't necessarily remember the event itself. But I could see it on my older siblings. I could see it in my father. I could see it in the older generations. These were cataclysmic events. And even those could not manage to shake things up. And in the aftermath of 67 and the rise of Arwa Saleh's generation and their best effort, extraordinary effort at one point between 1967 and 1971 to effect serious change, and then the failure of that, it becomes understandable that when it came to my generation, by way of motivation, a sense of despondence, perhaps even a stupor of a sort, just sort of landed upon us, and the sense. And I remember it at that time. It's like, no matter what you do, you just don't get anywhere. So let's just focus on our immediate lives, and let's just see what we can do on the margins. Let's just see what is doable per se. Let's see what we can do within the system and see if that might not get us somewhere. So you have to remember, you were also dealing with a very young generation that's not necessarily very wise. I mean, to write the story when you are in your 50s and 60s is one thing, and when you live the experience in your 20s is entirely another thing. We were not very wise, very self-aware, very alert. Some of us were, but if you're talking in the sense of the collective, that's not the case. The topic of conversation, the emotions, the psychologies were all despondence and pain and confusion and frustration. And then the typical, if you like, reaction of, well, okay, so let's see what we can do. If the larger things don't work, let's see what we can do with the small things. So you ask a very, very good question, and I don't mean to let my generation off the hook. And I do know that to a large degree we allow ourselves to get off the hook. But I have to tell you something also, if I may take just a couple more minutes in answering this question. In 2011, the uprisings happened, and a lot of us asked ourselves this question. And I mean, I remember it distinctly. It's like the shock on our faces. Oh my God, you can actually get rid of these people? That was shocking to us. And we really went into a very serious conversation with ourselves as to whether we could have actually done something when we were able to do it, when perhaps the systems were less belligerent, when they were still in formation, when there was perhaps a more open political arena. And then very promptly, 2013-14, you began to witness and experience the devastation of the 2011 uprisings, and you feared the conclusion that you were about to arrive at. You feared it. I certainly feared it, is that this incrementalism, well, doesn't work. This revolt doesn't work. Then what? And that's a conundrum. It's a quandary. And I don't necessarily have an answer for it. But I think it's very much present in our lives today, and it's very much present in the conversations. And I think I have to tell you something. It is as dangerous for the people, it is, or rather, let me switch this around. It's as dangerous for the regimes as it is for the people, because the story is not over.
Well, absolutely. And that was going to be my second question to you, which is, I mean, this is something you alluded to at the beginning of this talk here, which is to say that when you started thinking about this book, it came at a time when the Arab revolutions have gone through the process that you've just outlined now. And, you know, you're taking this time to think about your generation's past. And I'm thinking that you probably wouldn't have been able to do this kind of introspection had it not been for the Arab revolutions and for the fact that they had happened. And in some ways, the generation that you're talking about is part of the system that these revolutionaries are revolting against. And yet in your book, there's very little space given to the revolutions. I think it's more recent past. And so it, you know, maybe needs more time to unpack. But I wonder if you have more thinking around what could the role of your generation be in this moment in time. Now, when we see the counter-revolutionary trend sort of fortifying itself, as you say, there's this fear that reform doesn't work, revolution doesn't work. Where are we? Again, given the cohort that you're talking about and their influence in the system, how do you see this going forward, rather than looking back, going forward in terms of what kind of political change they might aspire to?
Well, I mean, the temptation to look at the book as some kind of a call to action is there, but to be very frank with you, there is no call to action really in the book. It's not prescriptive in that sense. First of all, it's early days yet. Let me say a couple of things about the 2011 uprisings. I know it was a short chapter, and I explained why in the book. I don't want to spoil the thing for the readers, but I wanted to draw at least lessons that I felt confident enough had a relatively long shelf life to them. And these are the 4 lessons that I actually outline in the chapter on the uprisings. But let me say something else about the revolts that we fail to consider. When they are talked about, they are referred to as a failure. And in this first round, obviously, they're a failure. But I don't think they're a failure for the people only. I think they're a failure for the regimes. And that's something that we don't give enough attention to. We may not have succeeded, the people who revolted may not have succeeded in this first round, but neither have the regimes. If you take a look at Yemen and Libya and Egypt and Tunisia, even those systems that actually remained intact, Syria, Iraq in its own way, it's not a product today of the 2011 uprisings, but we can certainly include it because it's also participated in this kind of fury that we have been experiencing and witnessing over the past few years. It's not a failure only for the people, it's a failure for the regimes. And perhaps one of the most important lessons of the 2011 uprisings is that, as I mentioned in the book, the emperor has no clothes and neither do we. This social contract or this connection between people and regime, that involves necessarily a level of performance and commitment on the part of the regimes for their people. It becomes very clearly it becomes unsustainable. And you see that, you've seen that over the past few years. So you have in 2011, the Libyans, the Yemenis, the Tunisians, and the Egyptians, and the Syrians rising. And then by 2013, it's all very silent. And the regimes think, well, we've dealt with that. It's done. And then in 2017, you see the Iraqis, the Sudanese, and the Algerians rising. And then the regimes deal with them, and you think, well, we've dealt with that. And then in 2019, you see the Lebanese and the Palestinians rising. And I don't think these are haphazard. I think these are very much products of the post-uprising Arab world. In the absence of some kind of a social contract, some kind of a connection between the people and the regimes, I think you're going to continue witnessing this level of fury erupting on a regular basis, periodic basis. When, where, what causes it, of course, is something we need to be very careful about predicting. What can my generation and my class? You're absolutely right. We're still young enough to have a role. We're certainly very influential. I have to tell you from my own, and this is, I haven't done a region-wide study of this, but I interact on a daily basis with in my own setting and with my own people, if you like, and I don't sense from them any kind of urgency about this at all. I think the role that they carved from themselves in the 1980s, a level of engagement through philanthropy or that kind of safe activism, an attempt to help in certain areas that about which you happen to be particularly passionate, you name it. It could be a legal reform, it could be women empowerment. I hate that word, but empowerment. It could be any number of philanthropic or non-governmental work. I think they have very much satisfied themselves with this role and think that they can best serve in this role. I don't think my generation and my specific class are under the impression that they could be of any kind of influence beyond what they are doing today. That's my sense.
Thank you, Amal. And in that, I think that's where the indictment lies, I think.
Yeah.
Kate, back to you.
Well, I mean, just to pick up on this, because of course your generation has witnessed now the loss of Syria, the loss of Lebanon, the loss of Libya, the loss of Yemen. I mean, the losses are piling up, and to sort of feel that, that's it, we've done our piece is, I think, as Tariq has said, an indictment, right? I don't know if you want to comment on sort of where we're at. I mean, we're in a sense, the region's at a nadir, and your generation's knowledge, skills, influence, wealth, are needed more than ever, and yet there are no channels, there are no ways to engage.
There are channels. I mean, it's an indictment of a sort. I mean, it depends on how you define change, right? It depends how you define change and how you want to achieve it. There are channels, and I think many of us are really doing very serious work on the ground. But I think your question, yours and Tariq's, goes to something different. Is it the kind of change that shifts the needle, that changes the general trajectory of the Arab world, or much of the Arab world? Because we need to be very careful here. We're not sweeping, right? There are certain parts of the Arab world that are doing very well for themselves. So I need to specify here that this is specifically a Levantine story, a Fertile Crescent story, this neighborhood, by the way, in Egypt, we need to remember, was the center of politics throughout the modern history of the Arab world. It isn't anymore. It isn't anymore. Even the politics of the region has shifted. We see now an altogether more assertive and autonomous and confident Gulf beginning to play a much more prominent and pronounced political role. So even the center of politics has shifted from the Fertile Crescent in Egypt and even North Africa. So we need to remember that we are in the very early days of post uprisings, I think, and there's something to be said for humility here. So it's always tempting in very difficult, very challenging circumstances, always tempting to try to grasp at constants or familiarities that can give you a sense of where you are. I'm not sure I can provide those. There are things that you can clearly see, but you don't know where they're heading. You don't know what their shelf life is. You don't know how they will intersect with other trends and other forces. But I think, it's extremely, when you're looking at the Fertile Crescent and the Levant in the future, you really have to let loose your imagination, I think, to begin with. You really have to be very imaginative, because Syria today is not Syria yesterday, nor is Iraq, nor is Lebanon, nor is Palestine. I'm afraid, people tend to kind of, Palestine is always there, and now it's reasserting itself as it should. So you're talking about, 40, 50 million people that are going to encounter a future that is in many ways totally different from their past. So we need to be, that much I can tell you. I'm not sure that I told you something that you didn't know. But what is actually going to, where this Fertile Crescent, where Egypt, where North Africa are going to be heading, I think we need to be really, really very, very, very careful. We need to sit back. We need to watch with humility and with anticipation, because I don't think this is the end of the story by any stretch of the imagination.
So I want to ask you about Lebanon, and Tariq is going to ask you about Palestine, and then let's bring in some questions from the audience. So the end of the book, you address your time in Lebanon. You've lived there 30 plus years. You moved there in 1990 after the war to, as you say, be close to your family and also to sort of follow the trajectory of the sort of development of this country out of the war. But you have an extremely complex relationship with Lebanon. And you call your chapter title is The Tourist. So you're always sort of an outsider looking in, with many criticisms of this amazing but inherently complex and frustrating country. And as you write, its residents veer between their faith in their invincibility and their smug fatalism about their irredeemableness and their incurability. And because it's such a fascinating chapter, Amal, I'd love you to talk a little bit about, because in a way you say your greatest disappointment for Lebanon, that's how I read it, perhaps I'm wrong, a little bit about this relationship you feel toward this country, but also if we could just go forward a little bit, because you're there now, and Lebanon, went through its protests, but then went through something nobody ever imagined, which is the complete and total economic collapse of this country. People lost 90% of their assets in the banks. They've been robbed blind by these sort of power elites. And I'm just wondering, in the midst of this incredible crisis, have you seen the power edifice shake just a little bit?
No.
And can you imagine this edifice ever collapsing and some alternative emerging in Lebanon? So just sort of your thoughts on Lebanon right now.
Well, my thoughts on Lebanon right now are very dark. I'm extremely pessimistic. And, the tragedy of them, there are many tragedies. Lebanese tragedies, but I think one tragedy of Lebanon is the extraordinary obtuseness of its ruling elite. And when I say ruling elite, I don't mean sectarian elite, because critics of Lebanon tend to focus on sectarianism. I'm talking about a political and economic elite that are enmeshed, and they are whose interests interlock almost every aspect of society and system. And this is a very reactionary ruling elite that has throughout the history of Lebanon, since independence in 1943, been extremely resistant to even the mildest reforms designed to make the system somehow workable and viable. And I'm not talking about, the radical reforms or changes on offer by, for example, the Communist Party or the Socialist Party. I'm not talking about anything radical like this. I'm talking about reforming individuals of the bourgeoisie or the ruling elite who understood that the system's flaws cannot possibly sustain the system without some kind of a genuine reform, at least to certain aspects of the political economy of the country. And at every single juncture and towards every package of reforms, small or big, the ruling elite fought tooth and nail. It is extraordinary. And they do it till this very day. In the face of collapse, you're saying nobody imagined it. Some of us did. Some of us did for a very long time, and we were called party poopers, right? We're pissing on everybody's party, and it was a party. It was a 30-year, indulgence of a kind rarely experienced or witnessed anywhere else in the world. But anyway, it's not only the collapse, the wholesale collapse of economic, financial, and political collapse. I think it goes to something more fundamental. It's the failure of this consociational experiment, Lebanese experiment. It's at the end of it. And even when they had driven us to the ground by 2019, they proceeded to push us over the edge into the abyss. And they're still doing it. And the system, you need to know, they're able to do it because the system, whether we like to admit it or not, is quite resilient. It's a resilient system. And for different reasons, the sectarianism, of course, makes it resistant. The very efficient security apparatus of the country makes it very resilient. This is a state where nothing works. Nothing works at all, deliberately. One institution that works rather well is the security apparatus, right? So this is a resilient system. And I think it's done a very good job in fragmenting and defanging and diluting and neutralizing any kind of serious organized politics on the ground. And we all know that without organized politics, it's very difficult for uprisings or for revolts or for protests to have any teeth. You really need to put very serious, sustained pressure on the ground. Without organized politics, and when I say organized politics, I'm talking about professional associations, I'm talking about trade unions, talking about newly founded autonomous, independent political parties. I'm talking about mass disobedience campaigns. I'm talking about strikes and sit-ins. That's the kind of organized politics I'm talking about. And I think the system has done very well in neutralizing this kind of activism on the ground. What you ended up with is protests, and they were serious in 2019. I don't think we need to dismiss them in any way. They were serious, and they had potential. But surrounding parliament for months on end is not going to drive systems like this down. And in point of fact, when they said the protests brought Saad al-Hariri down. No, they didn't. No, they didn't. He could have stayed there, by the way. He resigned because he saw an opportunity. We didn't bring him down. He decided to resign. So, unless you see something like this kind of organized politics galvanizing on the ground, you're not going to see enough pressure here to make the ruling elite respond. And so the real ruling elite doesn't respond. It does what it wants. And what it's been doing over the past 30 years is nothing short of criminal. And they get away with it. And they don't care. And they're not going to budge. And meanwhile, the rest of us in Lebanon have started to find ways around this because we're very good at this. We're pragmatists, right? We've been at it for so many years, we know what to do. There you go. So as far as Lebanon is concerned, people are always saying, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? And I keep asking, what do you mean what's going to happen? It happened. So, they're always looking for something cataclysmic, like, is there going to be a civil war? Is there going to be a war with Israel? Is there going to be chaos where people, run into the streets and into your homes and steal and thieve? And they don't understand that collapse can come also in creeping ways. It just keeps getting worse and worse and worse and worse, and keeps degrading and degrading, and you keep finding ways around it. It doesn't necessarily have to end in something, big or cataclysmic or whatever it is. And in the final analysis, if you want the system to fall, you have to push it to fall. It's not going to fall on its own. You have to push it to fall. And there was a crisis here, and every crisis brings its own opportunities. This crisis brought its opportunity, its wholesale collapse. And we didn't manage to take advantage of that. Not only, I don't mean to allocate blame here. There are, serious limitations. And I told you about the successes of this regime and of the system. But whatever opportunity this crisis presented, we didn't seize.
I know Tarek wants to bring in a question about Palestine, and then we should really turn to our audiences. We have about 12, 13 minutes left. Thank you, Amal. Tarek.
Thank you, Kate. I'm actually going to, I initially thought I wanted to ask a bit about Palestine, Amal, but just listening to you speaking, I'm sort of, I want to go to another question that I have. When I was reading your book, a lot of the language that you use and the way that you're sort of exploring the developments that have happened in the region, and obviously this is the focus, as you say, the Levant, so we're talking about Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine. You talk a lot about Islamization, this sense of Islamic conservative values becoming more apparent, and you relate that to sort of part of the decline that's happening in the region. And I was struck by that because I think that's obviously undeniable that, political Islam is very organized and it's moving forward socially in ways that, let's say, the liberal leftist elite are unable to organize or unwilling to organize in the same way. But I was also a bit uncomfortable with this sense that that's Islamization, and then the liberals or the seculars are sort of victims to that. Because if I look at certainly the elite that you're referring to, I also think that they hold very conservative values, even though they're secular or they identify as leftists. They hold on to very patriarchal values, very conservative social values, and in some ways have a big role to play in the increased sort of political strangulation and social conservatism that's happening in the region. So rather than sort of doing the secular versus Islamist binary, I wonder if there's another way for us to think about this and to sort of turn the mirror a bit inwards on the cohort that you're exploring.
Well, first of all, I need to be brief so that I can allow other people, but I'm very happy that you asked this question, Tarek. God forbid that I should ever submit to the binary of secular versus Islamist, because I fully agree with you. And that's the kind of binary that was imposed on us over the past 30, 40 years. That's what has come to dominate the political conversation in the Arab world, in the modern Arab world, the binary between Islamist and secular. And I think that was always contrived, because I have to tell you something. I never thought of the Arab regimes as in any way remotely secular. They might be politically anti-Islamist, but they were never secular, and they felt it. They had a real ease in being in cahoots with the Islamists over the social strictures that began to unfold in the Arab world, the family law, the personal status laws, precisely because of their distinctly patriarchal nature. So absolutely, and a lot of you're absolutely right. A lot of people in this elite, tend to mistake secularism for democratic or progressive. Absolutely not. They are conservative in certain sections, quite reactionary, and I think I have to tell you that one of the most interesting trends, if you were to ask me what is one trend that you really think we should look at, it's the post-Islamist trend, which I think breaks this binary that you are talking about. And this post-Islamist trend began to show itself in Iran in the 1990s, and it certainly became much clearer in Egypt after the uprisings. You saw it as well in Tunisia and in many other parts of the Arab world. It's a very strong trend, and I would say that this is the one trend that I would really watch and observe with much interest, and it has been very gradually breaking this binary that you're talking about. Absolutely. And if you take a look at one last word, if you take a look at what's happening in Iran today, rather than thinking about how this regime is going to topple or not topple or so on and so forth, I think people tend to be very lazy with their predictions, really. But the more interesting part is the kind of pressure that's being brought about from below about this this kind of liberalization, which is not necessarily purely secularization, but it is certainly post-Islamist. So I don't know if I answered your question, but
sorry, and I think this is a good time to transition to the questions. There are two questions, in fact, Amel, about Iran. And, sort of, if I may just sort of paraphrase them, one asks, do you see the case study of Iran as applicable to the contemporary political conditions in the Levant? Should politically disenfranchised Arabs look toward Iranian protesters for cues on how to push back against their own regimes? And, another one asks, why do you think you have all this youth activism in Iran right now and not in your region wasn't active? So just maybe comment on sort of what's coming out of Iran and if there are any comparisons.
I think you need, when you're thinking about Iran, I think we need to remember several important things. There was never a day in Iran where its women did not protest the social strictures that were imposed on them. Ever since 1979, and ever since Khomeini introduced the blanket imposition of the veil, Iranian women in one form, one way or another, have been protesting. And if you take a look at the last 20 to 25 years of Iran, what do you see? You see every 2-3 years an eruption, right? So this is clearly a crisis within the regime. Doesn't necessarily spell the end of the regime, but it tells you that there is a very serious dynamic there and an extraordinarily vibrant society on the ground that is constantly politically active. When it comes to the Levant, there are certain features that I see in common with this, but nothing quite as mature, nothing as evolved, and nothing as organized as the Iranian one. And I think we need to be very careful also about what we conclude about Iran. I think this is a very robust system. It's a very robust police state. So anyone who is under the impression that next month or in 2 months, Khamenei and is just going to stand up and say, okay, well, thank you very much, it's been wonderful, I think is they're seriously deluding themselves. This is a very long fight on the part of the Iranian people, and it's likely to evolve in extremely complicated ways. And you're going to see the same constants insinuating themselves, unfortunately, into the struggle. Foreign meddling is certainly a constant that we can never contemplate any kind of the change in the Middle East without considering. So again, I'm always very impressed by the Iranians, genuinely impressed, and I take very seriously what is happening there. But I think we need to be patient to see how it might evolve, and I think they're way ahead of us in terms of organized politics, way ahead.
Yes, it is a more sort of.
Amel, thank you for that. I mean, I'm just looking at the Q&A here, and there's a question about the role of youth today. You spoke a bit about this at the beginning, and this book not necessarily being a call to action, but do you have any sense of where the kind of organization or mobilization that can happen on the level of youth today should be going, and what the role of the youth is?
Okay, I'm going to say something very depressing now. And yes, I do see mobilization, organization on the part of the youth to pack up and leave. They're voting with their feet. Look at Lebanon. Since 2019, we're talking about, if you're to believe the figures, and these are the only figures available to us, anywhere between 220,000, 270,000 people who packed up and left in a country of 6 million people. You can be sure that a good majority, perhaps not all, but a good majority of these are youth. They're out trying to find work, career, safety, security, future, a decent life. I mean, you see practically all these countries, certainly in the Fertile Crescent and other places, pining for somewhere else to go, pining. So yes, they're mobilizing and organizing. When they're mobilizing and organizing here, they're having to pay a very heavy price, I'm very sorry to say. Take a look at Palestine. And I think what's happening in Palestine, in fact, is very, very interesting. And it's going to start grabbing the news more and more over the next year or two. You see them in Iraq. And in Iraq, they actually die. In Lebanon, we tend to be a little soft on the people who go out in the streets, a little soft. But in places like Iraq, in places like, Egypt, 60,000 people in political prisoners in jails. You see any kind of attempt to mobilize and organize being crushed very quickly. But again, I don't necessarily think this is the end of the story, but it just goes to show the kind of limitations, the kind of restraints, if you like, or rather constraints that within which our youth are having to work. And they also have to deal with the disappointments of the 2011 uprisings. And I can only imagine the heartbreak there.
Thank you. So I don't know if we should be wrapping up. Do we have time for one more question, Hania? There is a question here about, Amal, can you describe more of the characteristics of post-Islamism as you see it? But perhaps one last audience question.
Very briefly, absolutely, very briefly, an insistence that there be, that the religion begin to separate itself from politics. That's at the heart of post-Islamism. And this is not necessarily called for by people who are not pious. In fact, when it started in Iran, it was started by people who were the hardcore ideologues of the Islamic Republic. But there was a keen sense that the involvement of religion in politics was sullying religion dangerously for religion and for the regime itself. So at the heart of post-Islamism is a tremendous respect for Islam and its role and its presence in people's lives, but away from politics. That's at the heart of post-Islamism, to put it in a nutshell.
Well, thank you, Amal, Kate, and Tariq. I'm sorry that we don't have more time to take more questions. We at the Columbia Global Centers, Amman, really appreciate the enriching conversation of this past hour and the complex and thought-provoking issues that you've brought forth. We would also like to thank our audience for joining us. And I wanted to let you know that a recording of this webinar will be available on our website and on our social media platforms. Thank you again to everyone.
Thank you, Hania. Thank you, Tariq.
Thank
and
you.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Amal. Thanks for having us, Hania.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.